We're between the wars, and it's a period of time in the Episcopal Church with more trivia than you care to think about. So I thought I would just try to highlight some of the trivial details about the Episcopal Church between World War I and World War II. One of the big pieces of trivia is something that began in 1921, and that was called the That was called the AOC, the African Orthodox Church. Now, I'm pretty sure you've never heard of that, and that's an okay thing. There was a black priest who was a friend of Marcus Garvey, and very involved with Marcus Garvey back in the teens and in the 20s with regard to trying to improve the plight of black Americans. And so his idea about how to improve that was that instead of trying to find their place within the Episcopal Church, that blacks should leave the Episcopal Church and create their own church. Bear in mind that there was precedent for this because this had happened with the Methodists and some Presbyterians and some other denominations. The Baptists had all gone off and created their own black denomination separate from the predominantly white denomination. So anyway, he established the African Orthodox Church because he was enamored of the Greek Orthodox religion. So he didn't establish, the African Episcopal Church. He established the African Orthodox Church. Now, it looked very much like the Episcopal Church, but he was ordained a bishop in the African Orthodox Church by a former Roman Catholic bishop who had gotten mad at the Roman Catholic Church, and so he went off and formed his own church, and so he consecrated this guy to be the head of this church. He managed to attract a small following, but his big hook was Marcus Garvey, and he and Marcus Garvey parted ways. Marcus Garvey got to a point where organized religion, as far as he was concerned, was the very thing that was keeping blacks in servitude, and so he didn't want anything to do with the church, and so they split. And once that happened, the African Orthodox Church really did not have any real pull whatsoever, either to the black community or to the Episcopal Church. The AOC did establish a parish in Cambridge, Massachusetts, St. Bartholomew's. When they established it, they tried to become part of the Diocese of Massachusetts, and the Diocese of Massachusetts wouldn't have any of it because they hadn't planted it. It was coming in from the AOC. So at its height, which was around 1929, 1930, the AOC probably had about 30,000 members nationwide. By the end of World War II, they had about 5,000 members. Other pieces of trivia between the wars. You know the American flag that's in the church?
No.
Do you know when that began, when the practice began of having flags in the church? 1917. Anybody remember what the United States did in 1917? Yeah, joined World War I. We issued a declaration of war against Germany, joined the Allies in World War I, about 18 months before the war ended. Because of that, Episcopal churches began to display the flag of the United States in the worship space. They also began to do something else, and that was to sing religious songs as part of the offertory. Now, they had gotten to a point where they were singing the Old Hundredth doxology at the offertory, but with the advent of our participation in World War I, many parishes added singing the fourth verse of My Country 'Tis of Thee, the words of which are, Our fathers, God to thee, author of liberty, of thee we sing.
I don't think we ever heard that. I think we ever got out of the first verse.
Well, you know, where I went to elementary school, we learned all 3 verses of the Star-Spangled Banner, all 4 verses of America the Beautiful, and all 4 verses of My Country 'Tis of Thee. I can sing them all, but I won't bother you with that. Anyway, it came a time when all of a sudden the Episcopal Church suddenly began to look a little more patriotic. It was a time of prohibition. Okay? So prohibition came in the 20s.
How do you do communion if you have...
Well, that was the exception to prohibition, okay? Prohibition was something that many church groups across denominations had wanted for a long time and had been I'm doing it, I'm sorry.
That actually didn't affect anything, so you're good.
Oh, good, okay. They had wanted it for a long time, and they had tried to do it from one local community to another local community, and it was not satisfactory, and it was really ineffective until the government came in and said, that's it. Now, we all know what happened when the government came in and said, that's it.
Bootlegging.
Right. The 20s also, as we mentioned briefly last week, saw the Scopes trial. This was a time when the conflict of evolution and divine creation really came to the forefront, as if it's really gone away, right? There was great intellectual upheaval at the time with regard to all of this. Darwin's theory was the most prominent new idea coming into the early part of the 20th century, and it, of course, challenged the authority of the Bible and the presumption that many denominations still hung on to, that the Bible was inerrant. In other words,
They still hang on to that.
and there are denominations still today, but there were more back in the 1920s. And so in the middle of this, we get the Scopes trial about what can we teach and what can't we teach. This was also a time when the world of healthcare was changing. Many people don't realize that in the 1800s, churches of varying denominations led the way to create hospitals.
Well, it's quite evident if you go downtown Boston, you know.
It is, but a lot of people don't push back and realize that in the 1840s and 1850s, it was churches that led the way to creating a place where people could get their healthcare needs addressed, place other than home, okay? And in the Episcopal Church in the 1800s, it was the deaconesses and the nuns who served in those hospitals. Back in the 1800s, in the Episcopal Church, many deaconesses and nuns had medical training, and so they functioned as the nursing staff. Well, by the 1920s, the changes in the delivery of health care were magnanimous. And now you had doctors increasingly shaping the secular delivery of health care. So health care moved from being a faith-based reality to becoming a secular reality. When we lived in Munster, I served on a committee which is called the Institutional Review Board, IRB. Every major teaching hospital has an IRB. And every IRB has to have a community member. And the community member is there so that you don't just have medical staff putting on blinders and saying, I think it is a great idea to inject 1 million people with the AIDS virus just to see what new treatments we could come up with. Okay? So anyway, I served on the IRB at Rush Hospital. Rush Hospital was the consolidation of St. Luke's Hospital, which was the Episcopal hospital in Chicago, with Rush Medical Center, which was the Presbyterian hospital in Chicago, and a third institution, the name of which has been lost to the ages. And it was originally called Rush St. Luke's Presbyterian Hospital, and it's now just Rush. They've gotten rid of virtually everything. But the point was, it was an institution that lived out this early reality. All those hospitals were established in the 1840s and the 1850s. By the 1920s, not only were doctors shaping the delivery of healthcare, but the nursing staff was now, by and large, lay people, not deaconesses and not nuns. The 20s also brought a new reality that all denominations had to come to grips with, and that is the new reality of entertainment. Think about it. You go back into the 17 and 1800s, entertainment happened at home. We sat down, we read books, discussed things, played little table games, perhaps. What was the new, cheap entertainment of the 1920s?
Film, silent film.
Hollywood. Whole different reality to how people saw their lives. Higher education changed after World War I. Back in the 17 and 1800s, universities were established by churches or by religious leaders. I should put both of those. What I'm leading up to is John Harvard was a minister. I can't remember the name of the guy who founded Yale.
His last name wasn't Yale?
No, it wasn't Yale. I lost all the details, but it was another minister. Columbia University in New York was founded by Trinity Wall Street. You go around the colonies, and all of those old universities, all the Ivies, all of the old ones, were established either by a minister or by a church and or denomination.
Now, wasn't that because in order to become a minister, you had to be a learned man? And
Well, yes,
or had to go to university?
there is that. It also meant, who do you think were the faculty members in the early days?
All the church people.
They were clergy. They were indeed clergy. So by the 1920s, this is all changing. And we have secular heads of universities. And that I don't want to say by the 20s, that change began after the Civil War, to be fair. But by the 20s, it had taken on full force, and you would be hard-pressed to have found a major university that still had a clergyman as the president of the university. So you remember last time we talked about the modernists, who were the ones who were trying to grapple with the issues of science and the issues of church teachings. And they also found themselves trying to reconcile within the university setting what gets taught and how. People, it's funny today, people complain about conservative voices can't get an outlet at universities across the country. Well,
100 years ago, it was the opposite?
no, 100 years ago, much the same argument was being made. And the conservatives in question tended to be church people. as opposed to today. But much the same argument, that because these universities were no longer tied in with a church structure, anything goes. So, in the late 20s, early 30s, there were a number of people who signed something which is called the Auburn Affirmation. And the Auburn Affirmation said that biblical literalism is an obstacle to any kind of reconciliation between modern scholarship and religious views. Okay? The Auburn Affirmation, signed by many who would have classified themselves as modernists, was a reaction to an earlier document, pre-World War I, called the 5 Points. Now, the 5 Points was a Presbyterian statement of faith that many denominations looked at as possibly having some ring of truth for them. The 5 points were the inerrancy of the Bible, the virgin birth of Christ, Christ's substitutionary atonement, Christ's bodily resurrection, and the authenticity of Christ's miracles. These were 5 fundamental points that the Presbyterians said had to be accepted by anybody who was going to be a clergyman in the Presbyterian Church. Other denominations found those 5 points attractive and adopted them and or adapted them. In many denominations, the tough one was number 2, affirming the virgin birth of Christ. And so some denominations, and I believe it was several of the Baptist denominations, redefined number 2 as affirming the deity of Christ rather than the virgin birth. Other denominations took exception with the authenticity of Christ's miracles as being a fundamental point and said that it needed to be replaced or replaced it with the premillennial second coming of Christ. Now, all of this was simply a rallying cry for conservatives, not just in the Presbyterian Church, but in the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, Methodist Church, Baptist Church, etc. However, for those in the Episcopal Church, the rally fizzled quickly because they didn't get a lot of support at any general convention for actually adopting the 5 fundamental points. In particular, one priest who was the custodian of the Book of Common Prayer, and I'll come back to that title in a minute, said at General Convention that the current, meaning the belief in the 20s, in original sin was objectionable to the modern mind. In other words, believing in original sin in the 1920s was just ridiculous. Who would possibly still do that? Okay? His name was John Wallace Suter, and as I said, he was the custodian of the Book of Common Prayer. And believe it or not, every time we change the Book of Common Prayer, someone has been established as the custodian, the person who is going to ensure that every printing of the Book of Common Prayer by church publishing conforms to the way it was passed by General Convention. Now, the interesting thing is, I can't say for sure. I think there is a custodian for the 79 prayer book Yep, there is. There is a custodian for the 79 prayer book. But in this day and age of copying machines and printed bulletins, you have to wonder what the guy does all day long. Because churches have gone, computers and modern technology have taken churches beyond the idea that there's one format. It used to be that if you were going to print anything from the Book of Common Prayer, it had to match the font in the Book of Common Prayer, which is called Garamond, and it had to look exactly like that. So if you, I don't know how many of you may have watched it, but the funeral yesterday for Barbara Bush, if you were going to print bulletins like that for 1,500 people, they had to look like the Book of Common Prayer. You couldn't substitute Arial font. You couldn't change the spacing between lines. And that was the job of the custodian. It was also the job of the custodian to ensure that that subsequent printings of the Book of Common Prayer didn't sneak in something that was a little heretical. And so here you have the custodian of the Book of Common Prayer saying that the idea of believing in original sin was objectionable to the modern mind.
So this is the guy who's supposed to make sure it doesn't get changed, and he's putting forth change.
He's right, but he is verbalizing it. He's not doing anything, because that's not, certainly not in the 1928 prayer book. So the modernists in between the two wars wanted to bring all of these advances that they were seeing out here in the secular world. They wanted to bring them into the life of the church. They wanted to change standards, for example, in seminaries. It used to be, back in colonial days, the way you became a priest in the Episcopal Church is you did something that was called reading for orders. It was the same way you became a lawyer back in colonial days. If you wanted to become a lawyer, a doctor, or a priest, you'd find a lawyer, a doctor, or a priest, and you would go and spend hours in their office, and they would say, this is a really interesting book. Take this and read, and let's come back next week and we'll discuss this. Or in the case of a doctor, I've got an interesting case coming on Tuesday. You should come back because it's a gallstone, and you'll be hard-pressed to see a gallstone, or stuff like that, okay? So that was called reading for orders, reading for law, reading for medicine. Well, by the 20s and 30s, as I mentioned a minute ago, all of this was moving into a much more academic and much more secular format. And so people wanted to see seminaries in the Episcopal Church adapt to these more secular standards. I'm not sure about the year, but the Constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church referred to reading for orders, and I want to say it was up until a post-World War II General Convention. I want to say it was in the 50s that they removed the line that the training of priests could include reading for orders.
So prior to that, becoming a priest was more like an apprenticeship.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's...
And by the 20s, we had established seminaries 100 years before, but there was still sort of that, they were small, and there was still kind of that reading for orders feel. And by the 1920s and 1930s, they were all becoming academic institutions. Every seminary now has to be, I was going to say endorsed, that's not the word I want to use, accredited by the National Society of Graduate Schools. I don't remember the name of, there's a national body whose sole job is to go around every 5 to 10 years to graduate schools and certify that the program that the school offers will do what it says and will produce the product that they say they're going to produce at the end. And it's also, there's another group that does this for colleges and universities, and they all began to emerge. These accrediting groups began to emerge back in the 20s and 30s. The modernists wanted the seminaries to be certified by the accreditation boards. And of course, the bishops, who had been the accreditation board, wanted to maintain that. All of that would be changing at this point in time. So what happened in 1929? Stock market crashed. And believe it or not, it became a crisis of faith for many people. It also became a crisis of reason for many other people. The financial structure of the Episcopal Church diminished drastically. In the 30s, annual giving for foreign missions, which back in those days was a separate category of giving. Annual giving for foreign missions fell from $2.25 per capita in 1928 to 96 cents per capita in 1937.
What's that in today's funds, if you have any idea?
I don't have any idea. Just deal with going from 225 to 96. So,
Huge drop. It's over 100%.
right. So it's a huge, huge drop. No, it's not over 100.
50%.
It's probably about 67, 70% drop.
Yeah.
And that's all because of the bottom going out of the stock market. Interestingly, in the 30s, whether you were considered to be more of a fundamentalist or more of a modernist, both ends of the spectrum found their faith challenged by not only the crash, but then the overall depression, which wiped out so much in the country. And they were so challenged that the churches had almost nothing to say during the 30s with regard to the overall depression and trying to help people get out of it. Instead, social ministry in that part of the 20th century became the purview of the government. Now, the government didn't use those words, but how did it become the purview of the government? Because Episcopalians like FDR and Francis Perkins took their experience within the church and brought it to the cabinet and brought it to the national ability to address the issues. So when you think about things like the TVA and the CCC and the various other things that Roosevelt did, much of that came out of his experience growing up in the Episcopal Church at a time when the church still saw that as its primary role. The truth of the matter is the churches wouldn't really begin to address the worst ills of the Depression until war was on the horizon in Europe. So in other words, the late 30s, before the churches really could find their voice. It's hard to believe in an age where, something happens on TV, somebody's rights are violated, and you can find clergy people all over the place talking about how awful this is, and yet in the 30s, so much of the denominations just found it very difficult to say anything. Clergy, for example, felt the same pain that many people out in the street did, because if your stock market portfolio has gone down 67%, then your pledge is going to go down 67%. And if that's happening across the board, or there is no pledge anymore, and if that's happening across the board, you got a lot of clergy people who are losing money. And yet,
They can't maintain their buildings, they can't maintain food for their staff.
right, they can't do much of anything. Anyway, instead, in particular, the Episcopal Church did during the 30s was they continued these discussions between the fundamentalists and the modernists about science and religion and about the fundamentals of religion. And of course, these were the kinds of conversations that happened in small meetings, behind closed doors, and generally speaking, did not affect the average person in the pew. So you had a lot of Episcopalians wondering, how do we deal with the fundamentalists? And you had another set, how do we deal with the modernists? And yet on Sunday morning, there are people in the pew who couldn't put, you were saying a minute ago, couldn't put food on the table. The issue grew bigger in the 30s because the laity were really, by and large, were really uncomfortable with the modernist position, but didn't necessarily want to go all the way with the fundamentalists on everything. I don't know how many of you would remember the name Claude Pepper. He was a senator from Florida, if my memory is correct, back in the 30s. And by the time when I graduated from college and was working on Capitol Hill, he had been defeated for the Senate and then had decided to run for Congress and was a congressman at that point in time. And he was a character, like a lot of those old politicians back in the 20th century. He was a total character. Anyway, he was also an Episcopalian. And so he decided that he, on behalf of his constituents, was going to write a letter to General Convention. And it was, of course, in support of those 5 fundamental points. And so the letter got big play at General Convention, and I believe it was General Convention 34, may have been 37. It got really big play. And the Bishop of New York responded to it saying that the fundamentals of the Episcopal Church were neither fundamentalism nor modernism, but belief in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And the Bishop of New York believed that the Episcopal Church could continue to walk down the Via Media.
The middle road.
The middle road between the modernist and the fundamentalist. It's where we always end up. Not dismissing that position, but we're always trying to stay in the middle. And so the Bishop of New York drafted a pastoral letter to be sent to the church. And the pastoral letter distinguished between belief in and facts that we believe. Belief in, said Bishop Manning, means entire surrender to a concept versus facts that we believe. So belief in embraced something deeper and higher and more personal than facts that we believe. So he went on to say that the facts that we believe, in particular in the creeds, gave us a point of departure for free thought and speculation on the meaning and consequences of the facts revealed by God. Now, I only say that because this was debated for days. And I read that and I thought, only when you're ignoring the world around you can you spend days debating a statement like that. Anyway, the whole point of this was trying to say that there are things that we just embrace, and then there are just things that we list as being part of who we are. And of course, the problem with that is they aren't that separate. They are actually intertwined. And so the Episcopal Church tried really hard to separate them, and it didn't work. The bishops believed that they had a good statement, and they passed it unanimously. But not everyone, clergy or laity, was on board. Some really wanted to push the House of Bishops to be more inclusive of the modernists. Professors at seminaries on either side resigned. The rector of St. Bart's in New York, in the pulpit, took off his surplice and cassock and put on an academic gown to emphasize the opposition between academic thought and church hierarchy. I mean, people did all kinds of crazy things. The end result of it all is that it really didn't change one blessed thing in the Episcopal Church. It's just a piece of paper that if you go to the archives, you can find it, but I wouldn't waste my time. Anyway, World War II and on to modernity next week. See you then.